7 creepy, true Uber encounters. The driver who already knew my name. It was late October, the kind of foggy night where the city smelled faintly of wet leaves and someone had left a bonfire burning down the block. And I was standing under a sodium lamp waiting for a ride I had ordered to get home. I was tired and distracted, thinking about the argument with Jenna and the stack of unpaid invoices on my kitchen table, so my plan was embarrassingly simple. Get in the car, sleep on the way, unlock my door with the spare key, and go to bed. The impossible thing arrived within 5 minutes. Not the driver or the car, but the way he spoke my name when he opened the door, as if he had been standing in my living room for years. I promise I will tell you everything. Which rides felt ordinary, which ones left a dent in my memory, what the police wrote in the report, what the forensics team photographed, how my neighbors reacted, and why a single phrase from a driver became the thread that tied 7 small occurrences into something that kept me awake. If you get chills reading this, you are not alone. And when this is over, I want you to think about how many strangers really know you by name. The first encounter was the kind you think will be forgettable. It was a night after a small bonfire in a friend's backyard. The air still warm from the coals, the sky choked with fog that smelled like smoke and damp wood. I remember the rasp of sand under my shoes and the taste of ash on my tongue from a marshmallow gone wrong. Marcus walked me to the curb, joking about how we would all be ghosts the next morning, and I ordered an Uber to head home. The car that pulled up was a black sedan with a cracked bumper and a driver named Luis, according to the app. He smiled when I got in and handed me a folded napkin, like he had been expecting a small mess. "Evening," he said. "Long night?" My reply was the kind people use to be polite. We exchanged the trivialities passengers and drivers share. The stereo hummed a cheap pop song, the heater kicked on in little breaths, and the city lights streaked across the window. I felt the ordinary slip into a small, odd tilt when Luis said, as he adjusted his rearview mirror, "You should probably stop leaving your basement door unlocked." I laughed at first, a short sound like a bubble popping, because I did not have a basement. Then I remembered the basement storage unit I had rented 3 blocks from my apartment for extra supplies, and how I had forgotten to lock it that afternoon. Luis did not know any of that. The rhythm of the car changed, and I noticed the way his knuckles pressed white. On the steering wheel, the scent of his aftershave like pennies and laundry detergent. I asked where he lived. He told me a street name 2 neighborhoods away I recognized. He asked about my job, and when I said I wrote for a local trade sheet, he nodded like that explained anything. I told Marcus about it later, and he shrugged, but it was the first time a stranger named a private hole in my life out loud. The second ride came 3 days later after an evening of drinks with Tom and Priya. We were leaving a corner bar, the kind with a fogged-up window and a scarecrow in the alcove to celebrate Halloween, and I was the last one to order a car. The driver, whose name was Evelyn, leaned back and said, "You like to walk the trail by the river, right? The one with the old pumpkin patch?" I blinked. The wind smelled like river silt and old cigarettes. "How do you know that?" I asked. She shrugged in that way drivers do when they want to keep things neutral. "I pick up a lot of people on weekends," she said. "You look like someone who prefers the quiet route." Her voice had a practiced, tinny concern. This is where the pattern started to stitch itself into something uglier, a timeline of small facts collected and returned to me as if they were banked memories. After that night, I began taking note of details I had always treated as small. The crack in my apartment's hallway light, the way the laundry room door stuck when it was humid, the nickname my neighbor Nora used when she grinned across the fence. It felt like a mirror was being held up behind me, and the reflection had learned the shape of my private edges. In the third encounter, I almost convinced myself it was coincidence. I had been coming back from a day at the office where the heat had made the air feel turgid and the subway smelled like wet metal. My phone buzzed with an alert that the driver had arrived. He was an older man named Raj, and when I opened the rear door, he reached out and said, "Backpack on the left, water bottle with the sticker, don't forget." The voice was gentle, but the words landed like a hand on my shoulder.
I reached instinctively into the satchel beside me and found the water bottle and the sticker exactly where he said because I had put them there that afternoon. "Do you work near the printing press?" he asked. "The one on Caldwell?" That detail I had not told the app, not aloud, not in the pickup notes. He dropped me off without further comment. After I stepped onto my stoop, I felt like a glass being shaken slowly, and when I unlocked the apartment, a draft moved through the hall and the smell of rain followed me in. I phoned Jenna and
left a message more breathless than I intended. "Maybe they scrap apps from marketing," she texted back, but her text didn't cut the cold. The fourth incident felt like a lost key turning in a lock you did not know you had. One November evening, after a bonfire at a neighbor's yard where someone had carved a pumpkin that looked eerily like one of my old faces, I ordered a ride to a grocery store across town. The driver was a young woman named Aisha, and her car smelled like rosemary and phone charger plastic. Midway through the ride, she said, casually, "You should check the screws on the ladder in your garage. One of them is loose and it's rusting." I laughed and told her I didn't own a ladder. She smiled without the arc of friendliness, like someone cataloging inventory, and said, "You had one last month when you helped move that futon. You talked about it with your neighbor, Mr. Logan." The mention of Mr. Logan was the closing bar on a phrase I never wanted to hear again. He was a quiet man who kept to himself on floor 3 and who had been one of my first friends in the building. He had been complaining about a basement leak the week before. When I got home, I checked my garage, because I do own a garage space, and sure enough, a ladder leaned under a dust sheet. A light rust spot circled one screw. I felt foolish and violated at once. Someone was collecting small shreds of my life and returning them as if to prove a point. The fifth run was the one that left a bruise on my sense of safety. It was a rainy Thursday, and I was late for a late shift, and I almost didn't notice the driver who put his hand on the top of the door frame when I climbed in, as if to steady himself against the motion of the vehicle. The name in the app said Miguel. He adjusted the mirror and asked, "Do you remember the night the power went out on Sycamore and the pumpkins all went dark?" I remembered that because I had stood on my stoop that Halloween and watched a child drop a carved jack-o'-lantern with a small staccato sound like a crack of glass. "Why?" I asked. He answered, "Because the person who left the carved tooth in week 3 liked to walk at midnight after the show." He said it as if quoting folklore. I felt my face go cold. Tooth. The word stuck in my throat like a bone. The rest of the route was a muted blur. I said very little. He dropped me at my building and said, "Sleep with the light on." He knew where I lived, and he knew which lights I preferred. I didn't know then that this pattern would become a string of breadcrumbs leading to something worse. Across these rides, I started. I kept a small notebook in my bag, the kind you buy at hardware stores. I wrote dates, driver names, snippets they said, colors of their cars, the smell in each vehicle. I gave names to witnesses and friends. Marcus, who laughed things off. Jenna, who scolded me for overreacting. Tom, who insisted on logical explanations. Priya, who suggested surveillance footage. Nora, who brought me cookies and a flashlight the night after I called the police. Officer Ramirez, who finally took a report. And Mr. Logan, the quiet neighbor who had a basement and a habit of lending tools. I spoke to neighbors more than I had in years. "You're not paranoid," Nora told me once, hands wrapped around a paper cup, breath smelling like peppermint in the bonfire embers. "You're awake to something people shrug off." That sentence felt like a small rescue buoy. Backstory. I grew up in a town where everyone knew each other by first and second cousins and by the sound of their footsteps. My childhood memory is lined with a country house that smelled of hay and old coffee, and where I learned to read by the light of a porch lamp while fireflies beat at the screen. I left the town at 20 to go to college, and then lingered in cities doing odd jobs, learning how to type fast and to notice details others missed. I studied investigative reporting but never finished the degree, trading lectures for late-night shifts, helping at print shops, and then moving into a small newsroom where I edited obituaries and community events. The way I notice small facts is part instinct and part habit, It made me a good editor and a cautious tenant. In my 30s, I lost my father to a sudden heart attack, and for months the world became a linen tube through which I breathed shallowly. That loss taught me to keep spare keys and to call people more often, but it also left me fragile in new, thin places. Now I live in a fourth-floor apartment with thin walls and a neighbor who keeps a scarecrow on his stoop in October. I write little columns on local oddities, and sometimes the paper publishes my late-night musings about streetlights. Those years formed an archive of being observed and of observing back, and they are relevant because the pattern of the rides felt like a new volume being added to a library I had tried to keep private. I relied on dialogues as a way to test what was normal. One night after a particularly unsettling sequence, Marcus asked to come with me to the police station. We sat in the lobby where the air smelled like coffee and bleach and waited for Officer Ramirez, who had the polite flatness of someone who has heard many small terrors. The exchange that night ran long. "You say you were told things about your basement and ladder," Ramirez said. "Did anyone threaten you?"
No, it felt like inventory, not a threat. Marcus chimed in. He said she walks the trail at night. Ramirez looked at his notebook. Do you have the times and dates? I handed over the small notebook with smudged ink. We can check dash cams along the route, he said. Cameras are sparse, but there are a few. We will check. Did you save the ride histories? I nodded. We will subpoena logs if necessary, he said. He used words like subpoena and logs and perjury with the measured cadence of procedure that made the hairs on my arms stand more erect. The conversation had the long back and forth that a real report needs. What do you want us to do? I asked. We will log this as harassment and suspicious behavior, Ramirez said. If there is a direct threat, you call us immediately. Marcus leaned forward. What if the drivers are sharing info? Ramirez looked at him. We will run the IPs and see patterns. The dialogue closed with a promise they might follow, and that felt like a fragile bridge. One of the most vivid moments of tension is hard to compress because it kept replaying in my head. We had a small gathering in the courtyard, a group of us stoking embers and letting a small bonfire breath like a folded animal. It was the night Marcus and I both felt watched. The scene, the scent of smoke, the sting of cold air in our noses, the paper cup of cider warm in my glove, the sight of a scarecrow backlit against the fog, a line of pumpkin lanterns with faces half melted by heat. Conversation frayed. Someone said the word tooth in a light voice, and the laughter died. I felt something like the atmosphere before a storm, a pressing weight, a silence thick as velvet. Then a sound. A footstep on the trail that runs between the building and the river, the exact kind of crunch you hear when someone steps on dry leaves. We all turned. The footstep repeated, farther down, and then a scraping noise that might have been a key against metal. The group froze. I tried to talk, but my voice failed into a whisper. This is one of the 3 official moments of tension I keep returning to. The footstep, then a crack like a branch splitting, then silence. We searched the perimeter with flashlights. Mr. Logan's beam found nothing but the curve of the old fence and a trail of small imprints leading toward the water. The sensation lasted long after we stood close together and relit the pumpkin faces. Another moment of tension unfolded in the car that would become the hinge event. It was the 7th encounter, a ride on a night thick with fog and the city smeared into halos of orange light. I had ordered the ride after a late shift, tired and a little careless. The driver who pulled up called himself Daniel. His car was older, the upholstery smelling faintly of burnt coffee. When I opened the rear door and slid in, he closed it with a soft click, and then he said, in a voice that sounded like someone reading from a well-thumbed list, "You moved the spare key under the 3rd brick last week, didn't you?" The air in my chest folded. "Who told you that?" I asked. He looked at me in the mirror, and for the first time I noticed how his eyes caught the light, pale and steady. "Your neighbor Nora mentioned it when she borrowed sugar," he said. I thought of Nora leaning over the fence, handing me cookies and a small flashlight. I asked him, "How long have you been driving for Uber?" He answered, "Long enough to know habits." The conversation that followed had the density of interrogatory theater. "Do you know who I am?" I asked. "A writer," he said. "Do you know my name?" He said my name before the app told him to. The name landed as if it had been waiting on his lips. "How do you know my name?" I said. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, which was either an observation or an instruction. The car hummed, the heater exhaled, my hands felt like wet rag. My phone vibrated on the seat, a message from Jenna asking if I was home. "Not yet," I texted. Daniel drove the route a little slower than necessary, corners cut with casual attention. He asked again, "Do you walk the trail by the river often, past the scarecrow patch?" When I didn't answer, he said, "You should tell someone if you feel unsafe." It read like a curiosity, not a threat, but the knowledge he had spelled out fragments of other rides. In that car, under that streetlight, I felt something identify me in layers I had never given to anyone. The third formal moment of tension came later, after I had collected the entries, after Ramirez and a detective named Priya Rajan had run license plate checks and begun to look for patterns across ride logs. I was at the police station again, watching the detective pull up a map of pickup points and driver IDs on a grainy monitor. The night smelled of disinfectant, and the fluorescent light overhead buzzed soft and unsparing. "There are overlapping pickups near your building and near the storage unit," Priya said. "Same time frames over the last month." The mapping of those dots felt like a constellation forming into a face. "Where are they correlated to you?" I asked. She tapped the screen. "Mostly within a 2-block radius of your usual walks." My mouth went dry. She said, "We found dashcam footage from a private camera near the trail. It's grainy, but it shows a car matching one of the models stopping late." The footage showed a car and a shadow. "We need to interview the drivers," she said, and I realized I would be dragged through the parts of myself I had kept quiet, the basement storage, the late walks, the late night when I had left a pumpkin on the stoop for a kid. Being questioned felt like being untied bit by bit. I agreed to identify drivers and to share my notebook. The tension unfurled in the room like a held breath. My hands trembled on the table. This is the third key moment because it moved us from suspicion to action. Technical procedures followed in the time after the footage surfaced. The police logged the complaint under a case number, took a formal statement, and activated requests for ride service logs. Forensics photographed the notes I had kept, cataloged the water bottle with the sticker, and swabbed the interior of my car where one of the drivers had once sat. The procedure was systematic, item labeled, photographed, bagged, chain of custody signed, evidence placed in secure storage. An officer told me they would request driver information from the ride company and that forensics would compare any trace DNA from the water bottle to samples they might obtain. There was talk of subpoenas and data requests. The terminology was precise and oddly comforting in its distance. Once the police began contacting drivers, the pattern splintered. Some drivers were cooperative and clearly bewildered. Daniel was not among those who answered on the first call. He had canceled his account 2 days after that ride. When the detective found a match for his vehicle in one of the parking lot cameras near the river trail, the footage showed him pulling up, sitting for a while with the engine off, and then driving away. Another driver, Evelyn, met with us and said she had only guessed about the pumpkin because she saw kids on social media. A plausible link, but she admitted to glancing at public posts and piecing together small details to make conversation. The more mundane explanations did not account for the times when a driver had told me something I had never mentioned anywhere online. The longer I watched the mesh of information, the more it felt like a net woven from both deliberate collection and dumb luck. I asked the detective to pull texts and social posts around the dates in question. They found a thread of local photos from a community event where several people had uploaded images of the very pumpkin patch and of the bonfire. Someone in the comments mentioned a person leaving a carved tooth in a hollowed pumpkin as a joke. Another thread recorded a neighbor's remark about a loose screw on a ladder. These were small, public seeds. Investigator work is patient work, and what they did next was slow but methodical. Cross-referencing public content with driver pickup timestamps, matching app driver IDs to vehicle registrations, and knocking on doors to ask simple questions. Each knock produced a face, a small denial, a memory, a neighbor who had seen a thing and dismissed it. At the police station, Ramirez explained processes in plain language. "We can subpoena logs, interview drivers, and get camera footage from businesses," he said. "We may not get a single smoking gun, but we will look for patterns." Forensics ran the water bottle and dust from the car seats for trace DNA and labeled everything with barcodes that would live in evidence lockers. There was a moment when the investigation turned a corner. A security camera from a laundromat facing the trail recorded the shape of a man unloading a satchel near the fence 3 nights before the ride Daniel drove me. The footage was grainy, but had a turn that matched the silhouette of a driver. We showed the capture to Mr. Logan, who, to my surprise, said the man in the footage looked like someone he had once seen unloading boxes in the basement months ago. That man turned out to be a temporary contractor named Eric who had done maintenance work for a few apartments. When officers spoke to Eric, he became flustered and defensive and told a story of doing deliveries and picking up odd jobs. He denied knowing me. His phone records, however, showed multiple matches to addresses near the trail and to parking lots where drivers had waited. When authorities subpoenaed data from a ride service, they found overlapping accounts and driver profiles that used similar photos and the same vehicle details. The net closed in small increments and then widened in ambiguity. Patterns pointed to a clique of drivers sharing information off the app, perhaps trading sightings and stories, sometimes accurate, sometimes invented. The most uncomfortable twist was human and small. The idea that people you pass at night might be rehearsing details about you to feel less alone. I sat with that discomfort and with the knowledge that some statements could have been coincidences bumped into one another. I also held to the fact that the driver had once said my name before the app revealed it. That is not something that tastes like coincidence. After the initial investigation, we held a tenants meeting where neighbors came with their own notes. Nora, Mr. Logan, Jenna, Marcus, Tom, Priya, and Evelyn each had a reaction. Nora cried softly, recounting how she had lent me sugar and a flashlight, and how she now felt foolish for having brushed off a stranger she saw lingering near the trail. Tom scolded that we should have taken footage earlier. Priya urged us all to install cameras. The conversation had disclosure and denial in equal measure, and there were more questions than answers. We changed locks, we bought a motion sensor light for the back trail. I slept poorly. 1 month after the first time a driver said my name, things had shifted. The police had interviewed multiple drivers and had begun to see a trend of drivers sharing small local facts among themselves to make conversation. They could not legally prevent conversation. Someone from saying a name, but when those statements turned into a pattern that matched surveillance and that made a resident feel unsafe, the department opened a harassment file and advised safety measures. I changed the placement of the spare key, moved the storage unit to a new location, and installed a tiny lockbox. The city police posted a small notice at the community board about increased patrols near the trail. Friends offered couches. Marcus stayed over twice. Months later, the neighborhood social feed discussed the incidents with a mixture of curiosity and moral outrage. Some drivers were deactivated after ride service compliance reviews turned up mismatches in background checks. I felt a measure of relief, but also the residue of the experience, an erosion of a small trust I had taken for granted. I began to leave lights on more often and to carry a heavier sense of watchfulness when I walked by the river. 3 months in, the investigation had produced partial answers and a slew of explanations that were both mundane and unsettling. The ride service produced logs that showed drivers in the same time window, but different accounts using similar license plates or vehicles registered under different names. The detective told me that drivers sometimes rent accounts or share vehicles, which explained discrepancies. Forensics returned results on trace samples as inconclusive because environmental contamination blurred results. We were told by the detective to keep documenting, to keep the notebook updated, and to report immediately if anything escalated. I installed a small security camera above my basement door, bought a motion-activated porch light, and asked Mr. Logan if he would let me store a spare key with him instead.
Priya and Ramirez told me there was no direct legal action they could take unless someone crossed the line into physical trespass or direct threat. That ambiguous space between law and feeling is the worst, because it leaves you with rules that say you must be proven harmed before you are fully protected. 6 months after that night of whispers and drivers who collected small private facts, some of the most visible changes were subtle. The trail by the river had new signs urging visitors to report suspicious activity, and a small community patrol of volunteers started walking on weekend nights with flashlights and a strict policy of calling the police before engaging. The ride service tightened its driver vetting in our city and offered a public statement advising drivers and riders to be cautious about sharing personal information in the in-app notes. I gave several interviews to local shows about the psychology of being observed and about how digital and physical public spaces blur into one another. My column about privacy in small towns ran in the local paper, and someone left a note at my door thanking me for speaking up. Personally, I learned new habits. I changed routes, I varied the times I walked, I stopped leaving a spare key in predictable spots. I felt small rituals to reclaim my nights, telling a friend when I went out, and learning that watching your own story does not make you paranoid so much as prudent. The nights after the police involvement were quieter in one way, but stranger in another. Drivers were less chatty in the early weeks, as if they had been warned to keep to paper lists and neutral phrases. On the other hand, some drivers introduced themselves a little too plainly, as if to demonstrate transparency. "My name is Carlos," a man told me, "and I have children." I appreciated the human detail, but it did nothing to erase the memory of Daniel and his mirror-eyed stare. The truth is that part of the discomfort came from the intimacy of being known in slivers. People gather information to make small talk. People make each other feel less alone. But there is a boundary between communal knowledge and the inventory of someone's life. I will end with what changed and what did not. The police kept the case open as harassment and information sharing among drivers as a pattern. The ride service audited multiple accounts and deactivated several that used inconsistent registration. Forensics found nothing that could be tied to a specific act of intrusion. Legally, the case settled into a gray zone that many of us inhabit: public behavior that feels intrusive but not prosecutable. I moved the storage unit, changed locks, and asked neighbors to let me know if they saw someone loitering by the trail. I kept writing, because words are a way I map disorder into meaning. If you felt a chill reading this, it is because our world is built on exchanges that are sometimes casual and sometimes calculated. If a stranger knows your name, your route, the place you keep a key, and the way you prefer to walk, that knowledge can be harmless, or it can be the beginning of someone learning how to be present in the seams of your life. I do not have a film reel ending with a single arrest or a dramatic confrontation. I have, instead, a set of small changes and a community that learned to look up from its phones. If you have ever had a stranger say something about you that nobody should know, start a comment with "a time" and tell the smallest detail. It helps to gather pieces, to see if they are scattered coincidences or part of a pattern. I will keep the lamp on tonight and listen for footsteps on the trail, and I will check the locks again before I go to bed. The city lights look different now. They seem to map a perimeter I did not know I was patrolling. But I sleep better than I did for a while, because a neighborhood of people talking together is, if nothing else, a form of protection.